Thank you very much, David, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's always a pleasure to be invited to Dublin, and not least because it reminds me just how much we in the United Kingdom have to learn from the discussions and actions about social justice taken in this country. And just thinking back 20 years or so to the mid-1990s, when it was Ireland that led the way to adopting quantitative, realistic national targets for the abolition of poverty, something which is now, of course, part of the European Union's agenda as a whole. So it's very nice to be here. As David just said in his introduction, I have been working on inequality for a long time, and sometimes it's been rather depressing. It's been depressing both because inequality has been rising, and also because it's been very hard to get the attention of my fellow academic economists, and indeed of anyone. But of course now, much to my surprise, after 45 and 50 years working on it, inequality is having more attention than at any time in my memory. And that, of course, is very much due to the publication of Thomas Piketty's book, Capital in the 21st Century. This was a book which has attracted, again, not only the attention of TASC in the sense that he came here last year, but also, of course, of world leaders. And indeed, to quote just Barack Obama was led to say that rising income inequality was the defining challenge of our time. The Pope has called, apart from his encyclical yesterday, has also called for the redistribution of income and wealth as part of a new spirit of generosity. And at Davos, world leaders have said that inequality threatens the stability of the economic system. But what world leaders have not said is what they would do about it. So they've called for sustainable economic growth, but given little indication as to what precisely that entails. We've seen yesterday or the day before the head of the IMF referring to the need to tackle inequality as part of solving the world's economic problems. But when one looks at the detailed recommendations by the IMF to individual countries, it becomes less clear how this is going to be translated into actual action. So that's why the reason I've written this book called Inequality, What Can Be Done? I should also apologise perhaps for the fact that my voice, as you may see, has only partially come with me from across the Irish Sea, so I'm afraid I'll be somewhat hoarse, but I will try to, with the aid of some strepsils along the way, tell you a bit about what's in the book. The main aim of the book, I should say, is written out of, to some extent, a sense of frustration. That it seems that we're in a state of somewhat gloom and doom about what can be done. And what I want to do is give a somewhat more upbeat message that actually, as David said in his introduction, that the present levels of inequality are not inevitable. If we want to reduce inequality, and as let's see this brought out at the beginning, the if is a big if, because it requires political engagement and action. If we want to do so, then there are clear, concrete steps that are open, I think, to individual countries to take. They are steps that have costs, and they do require us to discard much of conventional economic and social orthodoxy. And I think it does mean that our political leaders have to move outside their comfort zone. But at the same time, I should stress that what I'm suggesting here is not a kind of unrealistic utopia, but rather steps we can take to reduce excessive inequality. That is, I think many people feel that the current levels of inequality are excessive. They agree about the direction of movement. They'd like to see inequality reduced, although they may not agree just how much they'd like to see it reduced. So I'm suggesting a direction of movement, and of course you may decide to stop at any point along the line in the various things I'm talking about. So what am I talking about? First of all, just to make the discussion rather more concrete, I'm talking about economic inequality, which could of course mean many different things. It has many dimensions, which I won't have time to discuss. For example, I won't say very much about my remarks, but I do say more in the book about issues like, for example, inequality between genders or inequality between generations. Here I'm just going to take a more limited view of inequality in household incomes. And on the slide, I just set out a kind of a simple-minded household accounts to bring out the fact that even that can involve different elements. Economists often talk about economic inequality as though it's a matter of individual pay. And that, of course, is important. For most people, it's the most important source of income. But it's only one of the determinants of household incomes. We have, of course, to look at that, to add up the earnings of different people in the household. And we have to bring in other sources of income. An important part of the Piketty message was that capital income is also very important. We have to bring in taxes and transfers. We have to allow for the fact that households are of different needs and sizes and so on. But it's the bottom of the chart that I'm going to show you firstly some very simple evidence about what has happened to inequality. So, looking at the United Kingdom and at Ireland, this shows just two indicators of what's happened to inequality. And I'd like to start with my own country, where the story really is sometimes a very simple, a very stark one. And when I show this graph to people in Britain, they're often very surprised. And if you look at the upper part, the line shows a measure of overall income inequality. That's looking at the population as a whole, the Gini coefficient, which appears in TASC and other reports. And the story there is one that in the 1960s, when the series began, when I first studied economics, at that time, the Gini coefficient was around 25%. And it was more or less that level, going down a little bit. And then we saw, in the 1980s, a step upwards. And this step upwards took us to around 35%. And that's where we've been since about the end of the 1980s. So the story is not so much one of rising inequality, but of having had a big increase in inequality in the past. It's the higher level of inequality that matters. And it is a lot higher. Just to give you an indication, it's gone up by nearly 10 percentage points. If we were to seek to reduce that back from 35 to 25 by just using the income tax as a way of doing it, it would mean raising all income tax rates by 20 percentage points. So from 20 to 40 or 40 to 60. And I can't imagine the Chancellor of the Exchequer having a smile on his face when he gets up in the House of Commons to announce, oh, by the way, income tax is going up by 20%. It was an indication of just how big this change is. Now, of course, in Ireland, I won't, everyone in the room is more expert, I think, on the Irish statistics than I am, and they've been very well presented in the Cherishing All Equally report. But, of course, the Irish situation is in some ways a less worrying one. The Irish one is the triangles there, which started off above the UK, and you've had the experience of being overtaken by the UK in the wrong sense, that the UK has become more unequal than Ireland. in that sense, perhaps the problem is less immediately striking here. But nonetheless, it's the case, as is brought out in that report, that the level is still relatively high. And indeed, there are elements that are worrying, like that shown in the bottom part of the graph, which is the top 1% share of total income, where it seems to have been rising since the late 1970s in Ireland, just as it has been in the United Kingdom. And of course, it's the top 1% that got all the attention from Piketty's book. It was what was happening with people's income racing away. But one of the things which reasons I wrote my own book was I felt that perhaps his book had taken us to focus too much on what was happening at the top. I think what's happening at the top is very important. But it's not the only thing to look at. And that's why in the book I want to focus both on the top 1%, but also what's happening to lower incomes as well. And as far as poverty is concerned, which I haven't shown you on the graph, there we have a record which I think is in some ways slightly more encouraging than the gloomy picture I've shown you here in terms of inequality. In that, in the United Kingdom from 1990 to 2010, the poverty rate was actually significantly reduced. So it's worth bearing in mind that those years showed us we could actually reduce particularly child poverty during that period. So I might grow too tall, Thank you very much. But of course, that experience of that time has to be qualified in two respects. One of which is that the evidence we have so far only goes up to 2012, and much of the effect of the policies of recent years has been after that, and many things suggest that actually poverty is rising once again in my own country. And in any case, the rate of poverty is above that in the 1960s, when I first began to study it, and when, for example, the Child Poverty Action Group was founded in Britain because of concern about the fact that rich countries should not have poverty at this kind of level. So that is just a brief introduction to why the problem appears before us. I'm going to go on, I'll skip on to that. So the question which every journalist asks me when they interview me about the book, why is it that we're concerned about it? And I think there are two important reasons. There are both intrinsic reasons, and I don't think we should lose sight of these. The Nobel Prize winner Robert Solow and the Paul Krugman had a discussion of my book, which is on a video in the United States. And the interviewer began by asking Solow why was he concerned. And he said, simply excessive inequality is morally wrong. He said it's more concerned in moral terms of what was happening at the bottom, excessive inequality at the bottom, excessive inequality at the top, a view which I share. But he also brought out that these two things are interrelated. We can't separate out, we can't just say, this is a problem of poverty which we have to deal with, and ignore what's happening in the rest of the distribution. The fact that there are people queuing to buy tickets on flights to the moon at the same time as people are queuing for food banks is, I think, an indication, as it were, that we have the resources to tackle the problems of poverty, and that's why these two things, in my mind, are closely interlinked. And then there are the instrumental reasons, and I just listed some of those there, and I referred just now to the IMF. Christine Lagarde has argued that we need to reduce inequality because that's necessary to guarantee macroeconomic stability. My former co-author Joe Stiglitz, in his book The Price of Inequality, has argued that we need to do so because inequality causes lack of social cohesion, increased crime, ill health, teenage pregnancy, obesity, and many other social problems. Political scientists have drawn attention to the interrelationship between inequality and its impact on our operations of our democracies. But the instrumental reason I just want to highlight is one which comes up almost always when we're discussing the reasons for concern about inequality. And it's brought out by the coverage of my book in the United States, where several people have commented that it is not just Democrats, but also Republicans who are now expressing concern about inequality. But the Republicans almost immediately say, my concern is with inequality of opportunity, not with inequality of outcome, not with the distribution of wealth or income. Now, that unfortunately misses the point, which is that inequality of opportunity is intimately bound up with inequality of outcome. Excessive inequality of outcome prevents the achievement of equality of opportunity. And we can provide the same schools for every child in the country, but the children who go to school hungry are less able to benefit from that education than those who don't. So the distribution of income and wealth matters as a way of achieving a goal which many people share, including myself, that of trying to ensure a level playing field. Well, now let me turn to how that playing field is determined and the economics of inequality. Economics of inequality is something which is actually covered in many introductory textbooks. If you open a standard first-year textbook on economics, you'll find in chapter 7 or 8 or so an example of why supply and demand analysis is useful, which is that it explains increased inequality. And the story is one which goes back to the Dutch economist Jan Tinbergen many years ago, who said, what we're seeing is a race between technological change, which is demanding a more educated, skilled labour force, creating a demand for skilled, educated workers, and the education system, which is producing or not producing enough people to fill those jobs. And as he argued then, that race was being lost in the sense that technology was increasing demand faster, and that was then causing wages at the top, upper part of the distribution to rise. Today we would add to that globalization, which was driving also increased demand for people with skills and training, and reducing the demand because jobs were going offshore elsewhere for unskilled, untrained workers. This is a standard story, and it's a standard story which underlies what most political leaders will say if you press them about what they will do. They will say what we will do is invest in human capital, we'll invest in training, we'll invest in education, and that will allow us to close the gap. Now, I fully support many of those measures. I think it is important to invest in human capital. But the thrust of what I've been trying to say in the book, what I want to say in the rest of this talk, is let's take that as given, because unfortunately it's not going to be enough. It's only part of the story. It's clearly important, but we can't expect to bring the Gini coefficient in Britain down from the 35 to 25 by measures simply directed at human capital. Now, why do I say it's only part of the story? There are two main things I want to say. The first is a simple, evident point, which is that these forces, technological change, globalization, are not somehow things that have arrived from out of space. They haven't just sort of hit us. These are the results of, in most cases, decisions that have been taken, of actions. The technological developments which have taken place are results of decisions by scientists, research funders, by investors, by corporations, by governments, by consumers, all of whom have made decisions which have led to these technological developments. and the way in which these developments are biased in favour of educated workers, skilled workers, against unskilled workers, or the extent to which they're biased against labour as opposed to capital, depends on how those decisions were taken. And it's my contention that we can't, in fact, leave those decisions purely to corporations and their shareholders. These are decisions that have wider implications for, not least, the distribution of income. For example, a company, and probably imagine which one I have in mind in a moment, a company may decide to invest in robots for its warehouses and in delivering its products by drones, which will largely get rid of its labour force. It will no longer be dependent on workers who want to be well paid and looked after. Taking to its extreme, they may compete for public service provision and decide they can provide meals on wheels to elderly customers by this process. So that you simply open your door and discover your meal or lunch on your doorstep. Now this, of course, will have profound distributional consequences in terms of the demand for labour and in terms of the nature of the service, because having your meals on wheels delivered by a drone is not quite as friendly as having your typical person who comes to the door and asks how you are and so on. And what I was arguing is that decision should not be taken purely on the basis of profit-maximising corporations. It's a matter in which society should take a wider interest and the government should take a wider interest. After all, the government has funded much of the technological developments that have taken place. And the smartphones that we've been asked to turn off were, if you take, as Staccato and Sussex has shown, if you take each of the elements of your smartphone, almost all of the major scientific developments in that were undertaken in publicly funded laboratories of one kind or another. So the first reason why, which is only part of the story, is that the forces, and here I've talked only about technological change, but the same is also true of globalization. Globalization, I'll come back to this in a moment, is also very much a matter about which we take decisions. The second reason why it's only part of the story is if you go back to my little household account, you'll see that the supply and demand story just deals with one bit, the bit of earnings at person one at the top, person two. The other things also enter the story, and in fact these other things are the things I particularly discuss in the book. There are 15 proposals in the book about how we could reduce income inequality, and they're broadly grouped under those headings 1, 2, and 3. So let me now turn briefly to talk about them. I won't discuss all 15 in intensive detail, so you can stop looking at your watches. First of all, though, the welfare state and taxation. Just going back a moment, there's no doubt that many European countries, including I think Ireland as well, after the Second World War, saw a very significant reduction in income inequality. And that reduction was due very much to the development of the welfare state combined with progressive taxation. And one of the things that's happened in recent decades, and one of the reasons why inequality has risen in a number of countries, I haven't shown you other countries apart from the United Kingdom, why it's risen is that redistributive process of the welfare state and taxation has been scaled back. The OECD brought this out very clearly in their 2011 report, where they say, the Secretary General said, from the mid-1990s, the reduced redistributive capacity of the tax benefit system was sometimes the main source of widening household income gaps. So the first thing, which I think we must seriously think about, to differing degrees depending how much it's been scaled back, is to look at taxing and transferring. The IMF, as I said last week, produced a report saying we have to take action. They said we should have more progressive tax rates. In the book, I suggest that we need to return the top tax rates and return the tax structure, more generally, to one of increasing marginal rates of tax, not all the way back to the levels we used to have in the 1970s or before that, but certainly move it further back. Now, of course, some of this you'll simply say, well, we do that already here in Ireland. Number 3, for example. But I also want to highlight number 3 because it's an example, I said at the beginning of my talk, how we can learn from Ireland. That we have in the United Kingdom a tax so-called on inheritance, which is not a tax on inheritance. It's, in fact, a tax on leaving your money, whereas the Irish tax is a tax on receipt of money. I just want to pick this out because I think it's part of the problem is we need to tell the narrative about why the tax structure takes the form it does. And by focusing, as the current UK tax does, on giving the money, we're somehow misdirecting people's attention. What we should focus on is the fact that the tax is a tax on inherited advantage. It is not the fact that people are leaving large sums of money, but it's the fact that people are receiving large amounts of money. And there's nothing wrong with transferring money one generation to the next, it's just that it's very unequally distributed. And to highlight that still further, I would use the revenue from the reformed tax based on what people receive as a basis for paying a payment out of inheritance to do what Thomas Paine proposed in 1797, which is to give everyone a minimum inheritance. Clearly not going to be very large necessarily, but nonetheless to ensure that everyone at the age of 18 would have a capital sum which they could draw to fund education, access to housing, and other things. One needs, I think, to tell the story as to what one is trying to do, which at the moment is obscured by the current form of taxes. And turning to transfers, I'm a fan of child benefit. I won't say anything more about it as such, but I want to take it though as why I'm a fan, which is that child benefit is a payment of a basic income to children. It's very important in terms of household budgets. Many people, I'm sure, are well aware how in cases of, for example, breakdown of relationships, how it provides a guaranteed source of income paid usually to the woman, and it's something which doesn't go away as a result of means testing adjustments and so on. But I want to take the basic income idea further and take it as the basis for one of two possible ways of reforming payments for adults. And the proposal I make is that we should have a form of citizens' income. An old idea, an aspiration of quite a number of political parties, although the version I suggest is actually not a citizen's income, since I, for a number of reasons, don't think you could actually have a citizen's income. And if you think you could have one, I'll ask you next to answer the following question. How many Irish citizens are there? And in the case of the United Kingdom, there is no answer, I know, to that question. We've never counted the number of UK citizens. We know the number of passport holders, we know the number of residents, but there are many citizens who are neither of those things. So, I'll leave you to mull over that point, Molly. But I think we need to have a different criterion, and I therefore suggested a participation criterion based on people who are, this is very much akin to the way in which many social transfers work today. And it would be, in a way, simply a cashing out of the existing tax allowance. The tax allowance goes to everyone who participates. The problem is that the tax allowance is worth more the bigger your income. And what this would do would be to pay the same income to everyone. Now this is taxes and spending. But an important part of the message of the book is that taxes and spending are an important but not the only part of the story. And indeed they probably are about half of what one needs to think about in terms of reducing inequality back to the 1960s levels. We have to look at what David referred to as pre-redistribution. I'm it's not a word I find particularly attractive, and I don't think it'd be easy to explain on the doorsteps what you meant by pre-redistribution. But it's basically saying we need to worry about what people get paid, whether they have jobs, and what income they get from capital. In other words, market incomes. That means, first of all, tackling unemployment. To me, it's quite extraordinary that unemployment seems to have disappeared from the political debate. Maybe, I hope it may not be true here. There was actually no discussion of unemployment in the UK general election. We seem to have completely forgotten that in the 1960s, unemployment was around 1%. The Prime Minister of New Zealand claimed at that time that he knew personally everyone in New Zealand who was unemployed. And of course, being an academic, I didn't take that at face value. I went and looked up the numbers. International Labour Organization, and there were 55 people unemployed in New Zealand at that time, so he quite possibly didn't know them all. But at that time, we regarded proposals unemployment should rise to 2.5% as being quite unacceptable. Today, 5% is regarded as a great success. So the first thing we have to do is to think about bringing unemployment back into our discussion. And in the case of the European Central Bank, we need to have them focused not just on inflation, but a dual mandate. A dual mandate where unemployment is also one of the objectives, and clearly to balance the two, but it should be there with inflation as part of the discussion. Now, how are we going to reduce unemployment? We've seen 20 or 30 years of measures which have been designed to deal with unemployment in Europe. They have, however, been almost entirely focused on the supply side of the labour market. We've seen, particularly in the United Kingdom, the powers of trade unions very substantially cut. I was quite horrified when I assembled the whole list of legislation that had been passed. We've seen unemployment benefits, unemployment insurance benefits cut very substantially and now limited only to 6 months. All of these measures on the supply side have not had the effect of getting unemployment down. So I think we need to focus on the demand side and think about radical steps, including the possibility that the government should act as an employer of last resort. After all, it then acts as a lender of last resort to support the financial system, and if banks are too important to fail, so I think our citizens. But of course, jobs are only part of the story. We have also to look at issues about pay. You'll see there that I endorse the living wage campaign. I also think we need to have a national conversation about the range of pay, about what's our acceptable scales in which pay is determined. And I've just come from Edinburgh, where I was talking about this and was making this case, and I was delighted to be told yesterday morning that they're, in fact, the Scottish Government are about to engage on precisely a national conversation. And, well, look at my watch at this stage. This is embargoed until 9:30 this morning. But I have here a copy of the Scottish Government's consultation document about what they think would make a fairer Scotland. So I think that's exactly the kind of conversation which at the moment is taking place in a rather muttering form in Britain, we need to have. Now, I also looked at my watch and saw the time and moved on, so I will quickly now just move to the last set of measures, which is about capital, something which we tend to forget. And capital is important in two respects. One is that capital generates income. And here it's fair to say that we've seen quite a big change over the last 100, 150 years. The distribution of ownership of capital has become much less unequal in virtually every major country. 120 years ago, most people had virtually no capital. Very small amounts of personal savings, people didn't own their own house. But today, wealth is much less unequally distributed. It's still more unequal than income, but it's less unequally distributed. There's still quite a lot we can do. I'll make various proposals on the next slide. But what I want to stress just here is that that's one aspect of wealth. But there's also what I would call the capital aspect of wealth, which is the control over economic decisions that go together with the ownership of wealth. And here we haven't seen the same redistribution. Because much of the wealth which people own, like their own house, for example, conveys no control over the productive sector of the economy. And much of the wealth that they own, which is in fact ownership of the assets of the productive side of the economy, are in the form of pension rights, life assurance policies, holdings in unit trusts, none of which give you direct control over the ownership, or the control over the use of those assets. So, I, like probably many people in this room, have a pension. The second largest holding of my pension fund is in HSBC. I can't in any way be held responsible for the decisions I hope I'm not held responsible for the decisions of HSBC. I clearly can't influence what their Zurich tax office does or whatever. So there's this separation of control from ownership. And that's why I think we need to think about issues to do with countervailing power. And the top list there refers to precisely some of these issues, of which the most obvious today is the negotiations going on about the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. Negotiations which seem to quite clearly to involve corporations, governments, and no one else. And that's an absolute transparent example where issues of vital importance to workers and consumers are being taken without any representation of them directly in the discussions. So it's a simple example. Now I think I have the last picture to show you, because this is another aspect of capital, and one on which I want to finish, because it in some sense completes the circles where I began on technology. What I've shown here is something which you very rarely see, which I very rarely see in the newspapers. And I see lots of discussion in the newspapers about the national debt. Our Chancellor is fixated on reducing the national debt. Now, that is an important issue. But if you just draw an analogy with individual circumstances, it's a bit like people saying, gosh, I've got an awfully big mortgage, and deciding to reduce it, thinking, well, I can reduce it, and saying, oh, well, I guess perhaps we should sell the garage and half the garden. If we do that, we can pay off some of the mortgage. Well, that's ignoring the other side of the account, which is the value of the assets. The value of your house will go down if you've got a garage and not half the garden. And that's exactly what's going on at the moment. We're being told last week, jolly good, we're selling off bits of the RSBC and bank for less than its value, and that'll reduce the national debt, which it certainly will. But it also means we've lost assets of the bank. In fact, the net worth of the government has gone down because that is sold off the rest. So we need to think about the net worth of the government as a whole. And why it's important in looking into the future is that if it's as likely, and probably Thomas Piketty told you last year, because of technological change, the share of capital is likely to rise. If we're going to see production increasingly in hands of capital-intensive, robot-intensive production, then that's going to raise the share of national income going to capital, which is happening in many countries. And then the question is, who's getting that capital income? And one answer to that question should be that the government is getting some of that. The government, after all, funded quite a lot of that technological research. And the government should get it not because of going back to nationalisation or anything, but because beneficial ownership of capital is a way of resolving the fiscal problems of the government. So increasing the net worth of the government, I don't know what the Irish picture would look like. If anyone could draw it, I'd be interested to see it. I think one of the things we have to do is to increase the net worth of the state, which will then provide finances for social and other programs. So I've just taken you through a rapid tour of many different proposals. The reviews, some in the United States, the New Yorker, for example, said, oh, well, this is all very interesting for them over there, but it will never work in the United States. To which I would reply, well, actually, hang on. Some of my suggestions, like, for example, public employment. I think it was your government, the United States Congress, that actually passed a bill, the Humphrey-Hawkins Act of 1978, authorizing the President of the United States to create a reservoir of public administration jobs to deal with unemployment, passed by Republicans and Democrats. So you've got a short memory if you think it can't be done overnight. And of course, competition policy was at the beginning very much concerned with redistribution. I haven't said anything about it. Nonetheless, it was very much about that. Social and Economic Council, including Ireland, many countries have already, and so on. Many of these things have already been proposed or actually in effect already. So that's why, as I said, I've tried to tell a more optimistic story. I think these things are not necessarily easy. There are arguments against them, but I'm going to simply leave you with ammunition to criticise them in a moment. I'll leave you to look at those. But I think that there are things that can be done if we're willing to use the fact that we are indeed much richer than we were 100 years or so ago to try and cope with these and the other problems I haven't talked about. Then I think that if we're willing to do that, if we're willing to accept that we have to move at least towards a less unequal society than we have today, then I think there are some grounds for optimism. Thank you very much.